This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading from our theoretical magazine, Communism, Part 2 of the study Race, Class, and the Agrarian Question in the United States, presented at the party's General International Meeting in May of 2025. Subsequent parts will be uploaded in separate videos. 1. Slavery and trade networks in the medieval era. The first great slave-based empire in Europe was the Roman Empire. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, the disintegration of centralized imperial authority did not put an end to the economic structures and relationships on which the empire was based. The Roman Empire had functioned fundamentally as a commercial tributary network, drawing wealth from the provinces in the form of taxes in kind sent to the heart of the country, and profits from trade. Much of the empire's wealth was produced on vast Latifundia estates cultivated by slaves, who mostly produced grain, wine, and olive oil for export. Slaves came mainly from the empire's constant wars of territorial expansion, which enslaved the defeated armies and the population of the newly conquered lands. This would only diminish in the early Middle Ages in the West, with the decline of military conquests leading to diminished access to slaves, depopulation, and political fragmentation, leading to reduced trade networks after the fall of the Western Empire. However, slavery mostly remained where slaves could be found and where the large Latifundia estates were not broken up. Across northern Italy and Gaul, the latifundias were broken up into smaller holdings, shifting to systems of independent peasant and communal farming by the Merovingians, who confiscated much of the lands of the old Roman elite. In parts of Gaul and the Alps, free peasant communities retained significant autonomy well into the early medieval era, with manorialism gradually coming into existence in the 6th and 9th centuries. Under the Eastern Romans, the latifundias persisted in Greece and Anatolia under powerful landowners of the church, with dependent tenants only taking a more prominent role as access to slaves diminished, and in southern Italy and Sicily into the 6th and 11th centuries until the Norman conquests. North Africa maintained the system even after the Islamic conquests of the 6th and 7th centuries under new legal frameworks. In Iberia, the Visigoths did not break up the old latifundias, but created a hybrid version that utilized slaves and tenants as they integrated the old senatorial and aristocratic landholding class into its new state. Early medieval societies, both Christian and Muslim, continued to make extensive use of slavery as a fundamental element of their economies, social structures, and warfare, even if it no longer played the central role it had previously at the height of the empire. In Christian Europe, in the Byzantine and Frankish empires, slaves were still employed in households, agriculture, mining, and the navy as oarsmen. Although Christian doctrine discouraged the enslavement of Christians, it permitted the enslavement of Muslims, or pagans captured in war or acquired through trade. In the Islamic world, including Al-Andalus in the Iberian Peninsula, slavery was also deeply rooted in society. Islamic law allowed slavery under specific conditions, which usually applied to non-Muslim prisoners. The slave trade linked different regions through complex networks that transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Christian and Muslim powers both participated in the capture and sale of slaves through the Mediterranean, along trans-Saharan routes, and across northern Europe. Viking raiders captured slaves in northern Europe and sold them to Muslim and Byzantine markets, while Muslim traders trafficked Slavic, African, and Christian prisoners throughout the Islamic world. Although religious teachings placed limits on who could be enslaved and how they should be treated, the demand for labor and the profits derived from the slave trade often prevailed over moral and theological restrictions, so that slavery in the early Middle Ages was a deeply rooted and widely accepted institution that shaped political power, economic systems, and intercultural interactions. Like slavery, many of the commercial, maritime, and proto-industrial practices were also continued on from Roman times. Since the Romans' Mare Nostrum, the Mediterranean remained the central artery for trade and the circulation of goods. Control over shipbuilding and maritime logistics was crucial in the Middle Ages. After the fall of Rome in the West, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, inherited and expanded this maritime commercial network and its shipbuilding traditions. The Byzantines retained much of the Roman naval system, but innovated by developing advanced warships, such as the Draman, a fast lateen-rigged galley, and by experimenting with state-controlled shipyards and naval logistics. The Draman remained the dominant warship of the Eastern Roman Navy from around the 6th century until the early 13th century, when it remained the most sophisticated warship in the Mediterranean, a crucial tool in enabling the Byzantines to remain the dominant power in the region for centuries, despite its continual territorial losses. Constantinople became not only a political center, but also a center for shipbuilding, where the technical means of production, access to timber, skilled labor, and state finances were efficiently organized. However, with the progressive decline of Byzantine power under pressure from the Islamic caliphates and, later, the Seljuk and Ottoman Turks, a vacuum opened up in Mediterranean naval dominance. 2. Early seafaring. This vacuum allowed the rise of maritime city-states such as the Amalfi, Pisa, Venice, and Genoa, which took up the shipbuilding legacy of Roman Byzantium and revolutionized it into an early form of industrial production. The maritime republics gained importance before their inland counterparts thanks to their direct access to trade routes and naval power. Genoa and Venice became dominant throughout the expansion of long-distance merchant capital, controlling sea routes, ports, and colonial enclaves in the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Starting in the 11th century, Genoa began to build its naval power by supporting the early Crusades, later exploiting its alliance with the Crusader states and the Papal states to expand its commercial empire and build its financial power and banking systems. Venice, in the 9th century, slowly built a powerful state merchant navy that protected Roman trade in the Adriatic from piracy. In the 11th century, it began to supplant the Byzantine fleet, to the point that the empire came to depend on Venetian navigation, a critical weakness that would ultimately allow the Latin conquest of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 AD, and the founding of colonies in Dalmatia, Crete, and Cyprus. The Venice arsenal was the first large-scale production facility in Europe to systematically apply division of labor, standardization of components, and centralized management. Venice led the way in the development of the Italian galley, a faster ship superior to the Draman with modular construction which could be more rapidly produced. At its peak, the arsenal was capable of producing a fully equipped galley in a single day. The ship production methods were tightly controlled state secrets, which allowed the Italians to maintain a near-total monopoly on galley production for a century. Shipbuilding in Venice was the economic engine of the Republic, employing thousands of craftsmen in a structure of privileged guilds that restricted immigration and were strictly controlled by the state. The arsenal had semi-industrial processes that allowed for rapid expansion of the military and commercial fleets. The development of the means of production in shipbuilding was the basis of Venetian military power, its economic influence, and, ultimately, its role in shaping regional and global politics. Venetian economic power was deeply rooted in systems of forced labor, ranging from salt production to mining, agriculture, and war at sea. Salt was necessary for food preservation at that time. It was also one of the Republic's most traded products and the basis of its income. Produced under brutal conditions in Chioggia, Servia, and the colonies of Crete and Cyprus, where workers, often slaves, prisoners, or local contract laborers, scraped salt from evaporation ponds. Venice also employed large numbers of slaves and prisoners in its mines, especially in Dalmatia and the Aegean Islands, to extract resources essential for shipbuilding and military supplies. On its galleys, especially in wartime, Venice employed thousands of slave and criminal oarsmen. Estimates suggest that a war galley had 100 to 150 oarsmen, and that during major naval campaigns, the Republic mobilized fleets of 100 or more ships, with over 10,000 men in brutal conditions chained to the benches. The ducato, first minted by the Republic in 1284, quickly became the main international currency in Europe thanks to the purity of its gold, its constant weight, and the rise of Venice's commercial and naval dominance. At a time when many European currencies were devalued and politically unstable, the ducato became a reliable standard in European and Mediterranean trade. Its circulation extended far beyond Venice's domains, reaching North Africa, the Levant, and Central Asia, and it became the default unit of account for merchants, bankers, and state treasuries. The stability of the ducat supported Venice's transformation into one of Europe's dominant commercial and financial powers, creating the first international banking systems. 3. Italian communes, proto-industrialism, usurious capital, and the first proletarian revolts. Other Italian city-states soon emerged, giving rise to the development of commercial and lending capital within the feudal world, creating the basis for the rise of the bourgeois class and the expansion of colonialism in Africa, Asia, and then the Americas, laying the foundations for the birth of modern capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. The rise of the Italian communes between the 11th and 13th centuries marked a significant break in the European feudal order, when the cities of Italy began to assert their political and economic autonomy from the German feudal lords grouped under the Holy Roman Empire. The communes were city-states governed by elected councils and associations of guilds representing the growing power of the urban merchant and artisan classes, organized into sworn associations to protect trade, property, and local production. With the revival of trade along the Mediterranean and Alpine routes, cities such as Milan, Bologna, and Florence became centers of craft and commercial activity, supported by urban militia systems, guild regulations, and increasingly centralized government. The communes represented the embryonic form of bourgeois rule, in which production for the market and the accumulation of capital began to replace feudal extraction of rent in kind. In the 13th and 14th centuries, inland communes such as Florence, Lucca, and Siena became centers of urban manufacturing, particularly in the textile sector. Florence in particular developed an industrial system of production of wool that employed thousands of wage workers with a highly organized division of labor, regulated by the powerful wool guilds. This early form of capitalist production, based on the transformation of labor into surplus value through the production of commodities, foreshadowed the industrial systems that would later dominate in the Netherlands and England. Florence's early rise in textile production during the 12th and 13th centuries was significantly supported by Genoese and Venetian capital, which financed the import of raw materials, facilitated trade credit, and provided maritime transport to foreign markets. Genoese merchants often financed the importation of wool from England, the key raw material for Florentine textile production, while Venetian merchants supplied alum, essential for fixing dyes, from Asia Minor via their eastern colonies such as Phocea. Between 1250 and 1350, Venetian and Genoese fleets transported thousands of bales of Florentine textiles to Mediterranean ports every year, with Venice alone accounting for almost 30% of Florence's foreign trade in textiles before the 14th century. The Florentine guilds of the Arte della Lana, wool merchants, and Calimala, merchants, relied on loans from Genoese bankers to buy English wool at the Calais Stock Exchange and on Venetian ships to reach markets in the Levant, such as Alexandria and Constantinople. But from the 12th to the 14th century, Florentine merchants and bankers forged extensive land links with northern Europe via communication routes connecting Rome to the fairs of Champagne, Flanders, and England via the Alpine passes. These routes bypassed the seaports dominated by Venice and Genoa, allowing Florence to engage in long-distance trade even without a fleet. These safe corridors were essential for importing English wool, which passed through Calais and Flanders, and for exporting Florentine textiles, silk, and luxury goods to northern markets. To protect these corridors, Florence invested in diplomatic treaties, commercial partnerships, and financial networks with cities along the route, particularly Lyon, Geneva, and Bruges, where Florentine banks such as those of the Bardi and Peruzzi families established outposts to facilitate credit, bills of exchange, and the movement of goods. All municipalities, such as Florence, forged military alliances with neighboring cities, waged wars of expansion, and built road infrastructure to ensure the safe passage of merchants and caravans through the Apennines and towards the Po Valley. The merchant elite of Florence, and its powerful guilds and banking consortia, made the city a key hub in the European textile production network, and eventually developed its own financial capital, which was eventually concentrated in the most famous and powerful bank in Europe, that of the Medici. Unlike the maritime republics, whose wealth was based on controlling trade through naval power, Florence grew by joining a network of inland cities and transalpine markets, relying on armed trade convoys, guild regulations, and financial instruments to dominate the flow of goods. These internal trade routes thus allowed the emergence of an industrial financial bourgeoisie, whose power was not based on territorial domination, but on control of labor, credit, and productive exchange. In contrast to the feudal system still dominant in the rest of Europe, Italian city-states increasingly relied on agriculture for the market, led by landowners who were also urban bourgeoisie who rented land to peasants or employed wage laborers. These agricultural regions, particularly in the Po Valley and the Tuscan countryside, specialized in market-oriented crops such as oil, wine, flax, and cereals, often destined for urban consumption or export. The result was a partial commodification of land and labor in the countryside, with rents paid in cash rather than in kind, and a growing reliance on contracts, debt servitude, and seasonal workers, marking a transition towards capitalist relations in agriculture. The transfer of the rural surplus to the urban circuits of production and trade further differentiated the communes from the feudal courts, laying the foundations for a more advanced exchange of goods. The first proletarian revolts in Italian city-states, particularly that of the Ciompi in Florence in 1378, were a direct expression of class antagonism within the flourishing urban manufacturing centers. The Ciompi, composed of woodcarters and other unskilled workers excluded from guild representation, temporarily seized power and forced the dominant merchant class to grant political concessions and recognize their demands. A power that the Ciompi shared with some of the minor arts, that is, with those lower on the social scale, whose members, although united in a guild, did not live in a very different way from wage earners such as the Ciompi and the dyers, without a guild. Although the revolt was suppressed within a year, it succeeded in securing temporary wage increases, broader access to guilds, and greater political awareness among the lower strata of workers. Similar unrest occurred in manufacturing cities such as Siena, Bologna, and Milan, where artisans and textile workers periodically demanded better conditions and resisted oligarchical rule. As a result of these struggles, labor costs in Italian communes remained relatively higher, and the guild system, although oppressive in itself, imposed some wage and labor protections that limited the unchecked exploitation of workers. In contrast, in the Dutch textile sector, especially in Leiden and Haarlem, conditions prevailed that allowed for greater exploitation of labor and lower production costs. Without the legacy of strong urban guild revolts, and with the help of state-supported industrial action, Dutch capitalists could hire immigrants, women, and unskilled workers at lower wages with minimal regulation. The Dutch were not hampered by the political compromises rooted in the legacy of guild struggles in Italy, which had allowed for more flexible and profit-oriented labor regime. Thanks to their privileged access to sea routes and connections to markets in the Baltics, Mediterranean, and eventually the Atlantic, Dutch merchants could produce cheaper textiles and transport them easily throughout Europe, gradually overtaking Italian cities, which remained tied to small-scale, high-cost production. With the rise of Spanish rule and its dependence on artisans and bankers, the Dutch would soon supplant Italy as a global financial power. 4. Italian banks and Atlantic colonialism. The rise of the merchant bourgeoisie was not initially achieved through the establishment of capitalist production, but through the colonial plundering of the indigenous civilizations of Asia and Africa, the looting of temples and riches, and the enslavement of their peoples by the Portuguese and then the Spanish. Subsequently, the conquest of the Americas and the slave trade led to the rapid enrichment of the merchant classes of Western Europe. While much of this wealth ended up in the hands of the landed aristocracy and the monarchies that financed the fleets, it sowed the seeds of their downfall as a ruling class. The mercantilist era of colonialism essentially meant ruthless piracy, organized banditry, and mass plunder promoted by an enterprising merchant bourgeoisie. But the bourgeoisie would only succeed in seizing state power and becoming the dominant social class at a later stage, after it had slowly taken control of manufacturing, overcoming the protectionism of the guilds and organizing it on a capitalist basis, as happened first in Flanders and England. Merchant capital preceded banking capital, which in turn preceded industrial capital. Banking arose as a tool of merchant capital to facilitate transactions across time, space, and different jurisdictions. Banks sprang up in the ports of Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and finally Florence. The banking system could not have developed without naval supremacy. City-states used fleets to protect Mediterranean trade routes from rivals and pirates. In the 15th century, the Medici rose to power not by fighting the church, but by becoming its bankers. Merchant capital secured its place by financing feudal authority. As Marx wrote in the third volume of Capital, merchant capital always depends on surplus value derived from capital in production. Therefore, merchants continued to be a secondary class compared to feudal lords on the world stage. Despite its role as the financial capital of the Western world, unlike Spain and Portugal, Italy was politically fragmented, divided into rival city-states. There was no unified monarchy or national government capable of mobilizing long-term state investment, nor was there a large population available to establish colonial control over indigenous peoples and large tracts of land. Therefore, Italian city-states pursued regional domination and Mediterranean trade, not empires and the acquisition of overseas territories. Merchant capital in Italy remained enclosed within city walls, with no unified national state to defend it. It was therefore the Spanish feudal crown that financed the Genoese adventurer and former merchant sailor Christopher Columbus, who arrived in the Americas in 1492. The Spanish monarchy wanted to break the Portuguese monopoly on the eastern trade routes to Asia, expand its territorial dominion, and enrich itself through colonial plunder. The Iberian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal were engaged in feudal rivalry, but Portugal had secured papal support for its conquests in Africa and Asia. Columbus's voyage was an opportunity for Spain to claim new territories, undermine Portuguese commercial hegemony, and reaffirm Spanish prestige after centuries of fragmentation and war. Columbus's voyage was a move in the competition between absolutist states for global supremacy at the dawn of the capitalist world market. As Marx wrote in the first volume of Capital, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extermination, enslavement, and burial in the mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a hunting ground for the slave trade marked the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the principal moments of primitive accumulation. Immediately following came the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe as its theater. Slavery is an economic category of the highest importance. Without slavery, there is no cotton. Without cotton, there is no modern industry. It is slavery that gave value to the colonies. It is the colonies that created world trade, and world trade is the precondition for large-scale industry. 5. From Roman Latifundia to the Reconquista and slave plantations in the Americas. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the Iberian Peninsula retained many of the agricultural and social structures inherited from Roman rule. Among these, the system of Latifundia, vast estates owned by the elite and cultivated by slaves or peasants. While the classical Roman model of slavery declined during the Visigoth period, 5th to 8th centuries, the basic structure of land concentration survived. The large estates continued to function, now increasingly dependent on colonos, or land-bound laborers, in conditions of semi-servitude. These land relations and agricultural production methods were parallel to the enduring power of the Roman landowning elite, who were integrated within the Visigothic class society. In the south, the former province of Baetica continued to be a center of olive oil and cereal production, with large estates forming the core of the rural economy. With the Muslim conquest of the Iberian Peninsula initiated in 711, these state structures were neither abolished nor completely replaced. On the contrary, under the rule of the Umayyad Caliphate and subsequent local Muslim dynasties, many large estates continued to function, often expanding and improving thanks to the introduction of sophisticated irrigation systems, kanat, acequias, and the cultivation of new crops, such as citrus fruits, cotton, and rice. Muslim rulers maintained hierarchical agrarian relations. While some lands were held directly by the state or distributed to the military elite according to the Iqta system, large areas of southern Iberia continued to function much like their Roman predecessors, with landowners supervising the work of Muslim peasants, slaves, and seasonal workers. The agricultural treatises of Al-Andalus, such as those of Ibn al-Awam, testify to the advanced agronomic techniques developed under this system, but also reveal the continuing importance of latifundia-based production. The Reconquista refers to the long process by which the Christian kingdoms from the 8th to the 15th centuries conquered the Muslim territories in the Iberian Peninsula. It accelerated the return of the latifundia model in explicitly Christian and feudal terms. As Muslim lands were confiscated, Christian monarchs redistributed them according to systems such as the Repartimento, Castile and Aragon, and the Aforamento, Portugal. These policies granted large tracts of land to nobles, military orders, such as the Order of Santiago or Calatrava, and the Catholic Church. The beneficiaries of these properties were also granted jurisdictional control over the peasants and the right to demand taxes, labor, or rents. In many areas, particularly in Andalusia, Extremadura, and Alentejo, post-Reconquista properties closely resembled Roman Latifundia, with huge estates worked by Muslim peasants, mudejares, then forcibly Christianized, moriscos, slaves, or landless Christian peasants. Muslim prisoners for the War of Granada, which ended in 1492, and previous battles were enslaved on a large scale and forced into agricultural labor. In Portugal, especially in the south, large estates, morgado or latifundio, became the dominant form of land ownership, mirroring what was happening throughout the peninsula. By the 16th century, the latifundia system had essentially been completely re-established and institutionalized in both Spain and Portugal. Estates were legally guaranteed through mayorazgos, hereditary fiefdoms, that prevented the division of land and reinforced aristocratic monopolies. Work on these estates became increasingly diversified with Muslim slaves, Christian serfs, and laborers all working the same plots of land, depending on the region and the crop. The dominance of large estates stifled agricultural innovation in many areas and created sharp class divisions in rural life. Thus, the latifundia system in Iberia did not disappear with the Roman Empire, but evolved through the Visigothic, Islamic, and Christian feudal phases, reaching renewed strength in the wake of the Reconquista. This system became the structural pillar of the internal wealth of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, providing grain, livestock, olive oil, and other basic products necessary to sustain the expanding military and administrative states. The Reconquista was not only a territorial and religious campaign, but also a long practical school of military organization, labor exploitation, and agricultural administration. Christian lords learned to manage the large estates confiscated from Muslim landowners, and to organize the workforce composed of various subjugated peoples, mudejares, moriscos, and African slaves. These experiences provided the logistical and ideological model for subsequent overseas expansion. The institutions for managing property, forced labor, and land ownership created in Iberia would later be exported almost seamlessly to the colonies. It is no coincidence that the systems of the encomienda and hacienda in the Americas and the fazendas in Brazil mirrored the Iberian latifundia in both size and operation. The Iberian elites already knew how to profit from mass servitude and colonial-style agriculture, having done so for centuries in their homeland. 6. Rise of Portuguese naval power. Parallel to this agrarian consolidation, there was the rise of Portuguese naval power. Following the Reconquista, Portugal emerged as a small, relatively resource-poor kingdom with limited land and few internal markets, compared to its larger Iberian neighbor, Castile. Geographically confined to the Atlantic edge of Europe, Portugal lacked the necessary agricultural wealth or manpower to expand overland. These material limitations, rather than hindering the kingdom, pushed it towards maritime expansion as a national strategy. Recognizing the potential of the sea, the Portuguese crown, especially under Prince Henry the Navigator, invested heavily in a state-sponsored project of exploration, shipbuilding, and navigational training that aimed to bypass Muslim-controlled trade routes and access wealth directly from Africa and Asia. Central to this project was the creation of a knowledge monopoly regarding Atlantic seafaring methods, whereby the Portuguese crown centralized and safeguarded navigational information, maps, and ship design, treating them as state secrets. All major discoveries such as coastlines, winds, ocean currents, port locations, and landmarks were immediately reported to the crown and documented. Maps were held in strictly controlled royal archives. Ship captains and crews were often sworn to secrecy. While other powers printed and sold maps, Portugal restricted this information. Jewish cartographers expelled elsewhere were welcome to Portugal, and they hired many foreign naval experts. By controlling the flow of maritime knowledge, the state ensured that discoveries benefited the crown and could not be easily replicated by rival powers. This monopoly allowed Portuguese mariners to push further along the African coast each year with increasing confidence. The caravel, developed in this context during the 1430s, embodied this synthesis. A nimble, wind-resistant vessel designed specifically for Atlantic conditions, designed to navigate challenging winds and currents of the Atlantic, the caravel was light, fast, and maneuverable, with a shallow draft ideal for coastal exploration. Its use of lateen sails, adapted from Mediterranean and Arab vessels, allowed it to sail against the wind, a crucial advantage in returning from voyages along the West African coast. The caravel became the tool by which Portuguese navigators reached West Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, India, and eventually Brazil, securing vast trade networks. The Portuguese drew heavily from Italian maritime knowledge, particularly from the Genoese and Venetian traditions. Italian shipbuilding influenced hull design and rigging, while Italian navigators introduced crucial tools like portolan charts, the compass, and celestial instruments. Genoese explorers and mapmakers were often directly employed by Portugal, contributing their expertise to the growing Atlantic enterprise. This fusion of Mediterranean techniques with Atlantic experience allowed the Portuguese to outpace their European rivals in overseas expansion. Portugal's deliberate investment in maritime knowledge, infrastructure, and secrecy enabled it to dominate Atlantic exploration for nearly a century before other European powers caught up. What began as a response to geographic constraint became one of the most successful state-sponsored expansion projects in world history. Lisbon soon became a hub of trans-Mediterranean knowledge networks, combining Iberian feudal methods of conquest with Italian mercantile capitalism. 7. The Portuguese, African early state development, and the East Sahara slave trade. Africa in this period was a continent of great political diversity, where large states coexisted alongside vast regions inhabited by stateless societies still in a state of primitive communism. Much of sub-Saharan Africa remained organized through kin-based lineage or clan systems, with no centralized government. These stateless societies, common in forested regions, pastoralist zones, and less accessible highlands, governed themselves through communal consensus, oral traditions, and local chiefs. They practiced communal land ownership, collective non-stratified distribution of goods absent well-defined class hierarchy, and generally lacked standing armies or formal bureaucracies. Early African kingdoms and empires had emerged later than those in Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, in several regions with varying levels of political centralization and economic development. In West Africa, empires like Ghana, 700 to 1240 CE, Mali, 1230 to 1600, and Songhai, 1464 to 1591, developed complex states with royal courts, taxation systems, professional armies, and vast trade networks connected to the Islamic world through the trans-Saharan trade routes. In the Nile Valley, Christian and Muslim states such as Nubia, Aksum, and later Ethiopia had written languages, monumental architecture, and state religions. In Central and Southern Africa, states like Congo, Great Zimbabwe, and Mapungubwe controlled trade routes and developed ruling elites, but often with more fluid political structures. These states were still surrounded by or bordered stateless or semi-centralized communities, which were often targets for expansion, tribute, and enslavement. In the 15th century, approximately 60 to 70% of African landmass was occupied by stateless societies comprising 50 to 60% of the population. The map of Africa in the 15th century was a patchwork of powerful kingdoms surrounded by vast zones of decentralized societies, with interactions marked by trade, warfare, and shifting alliances. The African kingdoms developed complex class hierarchies and expanded their influence by enslaving members of stateless or fragmented societies in the interior. These enslaved populations, lacking political centralization or organized armies, were frequently raided and sold in exchange for gold, horses, textiles, and later firearms, first to the Islamic world, then primarily to Europeans. Slavery became a central economic engine for many early African states, both as a source of labor and as a tradable commodity that helped consolidate and advance their power as they fought innumerable wars with the surrounding tribes and clans who resisted the expansion of their states. It was first the expansion of Islam across North and East Africa, beginning in the 7th century, which created a vast integrated trading system that significantly increased the demand for African slaves. Under the Umayyad, 661 to 750, and Abbasid, 750 to 1258, caliphates, and later under various Islamic sultanates, a flourishing trade in African captives stretched across the Sahara, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean. By some estimates, over 5 million Africans were trafficked via these eastern routes between 650 and 1600 CE, destined for markets in Egypt, Arabia, Persia, and India. With the rise of the Ottoman Empire in 1299, and especially after the conquest of Egypt and the Hijaz in 1517, the Ottomans took control of major slave trading hubs in North and East Africa. The Ottoman Empire dominated the Red Sea and controlled crucial port cities like Suakin and Massawa, as well as parts of Sudan and Somalia. The Ottomans institutionalized slavery, using African slaves in their imperial bureaucracy, harems, and army. Black eunuchs from East Africa played prominent roles in the Ottoman imperial court, while others were forced into plantation labor or military service. African slaves were taxed, traded, and conscripted as part of the broader Ottoman economic system. According to some estimates, over 1 million African slaves were transported to the Middle East during the 16th to 18th centuries, many of them supplied through Ottoman-controlled or influenced territories in Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Swahili coast. Meanwhile, the early African slaves used the proceeds from slave sales to purchase horses, swords, and eventually firearms, helping to strengthen their own standing armies and expand their regional systems of property relations and class domination. During this time, European access to the African interior was limited by Muslim control of trade routes, and the Islamic powers were more or less locked into a constant state of war with the Christian states. However, the Portuguese were the first to begin to circumvent this blockade through their maritime innovations. By the 1430s, the Portuguese established contact with Senegambia, then rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. In East Africa, they seized Kilwa and Mombasa in 1505, asserting naval dominance in the Indian Ocean and breaking into existing slave networks. By establishing forts and trading posts in places like Sofala, Mozambique, and Zanzibar, the Portuguese gained access to slave markets and natural resources previously monopolized by Muslim and Ottoman traders. They began redirecting slaves to Atlantic markets, especially to plantations in São Tomé, Cape Verde, and eventually Brazil, creating the early framework of the transatlantic slave trade. This shift in control only intensified the enslavement of stateless Africans. African kingdoms in both West and East Africa continued to enslave weaker, non-centralized communities to supply foreign demand. The Songhai Empire, circa 1464 to 1591, for example, integrated slave labor into its economy, while East African kingdoms like the Yao and Makwa later became major suppliers of slaves to both Arab and European traders. Stateless societies, lacking writing systems, military organization, and foreign alliances, were systematically targeted. Between 1500 and 1800, historians estimate that over 10 million Africans were trafficked via Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and transatlantic routes combined. The rise of class society in Africa, driven by trade and conquest, created an enduring structure of internal exploitation that colonial powers, both Islamic and Christian, would profit from for centuries. Despite their naval power, the Portuguese did not attempt to fully conquer powerful African kingdoms. West and East African states were too populous, militarily organized, and politically complex to be easily subdued. Attempts at capturing slaves themselves often proved difficult. Instead, Portugal opted for a more pragmatic approach by establishing fortified coastal trading posts like Elmina, São Jorge da Mina, and Mozambique Island, to secure access to African markets without expensive military campaigns inland. Rather than colonizing Africa directly, Portugal directed its colonial energies toward building plantation colonies elsewhere, particularly on offshore islands like São Tomé, Cape Verde, and Madeira. These islands served as proving grounds for the full plantation slavery model, where African slaves were used to cultivate sugar for export to Europe. By the early 1500s, these colonies were highly profitable, incentivizing the expansion of the slave trade. African kingdoms, now deeply tied into the Atlantic economy, began intensifying slaving expeditions using European weapons, thereby fueling a violent feedback loop whereby more slaves brought more weapons, which enabled more slave raids. In time, the Portuguese and other European powers would replicate this system in the Americas, especially in Brazil, where millions of enslaved Africans were sent over the next 3 centuries. Where early African states had only controlled 40 to 50% of the African landmass in the early 1500s, by the early 1800s they now controlled an estimated 60 to 70%, developing class and property relations across the continent as they enriched themselves through their own domestic exploitation of slave labor and leveraging it as a lucrative export commodity to finance their own states' constant wars of expansion into the lands of the stateless peoples still living under a condition of primitive communism. In 1441, Portuguese captains captured Africans in the Senegal River and took them to Lagos. By the middle of the 15th century, Portugal was already importing thousands of slaves to Lisbon, where in 1550, 10% of the population consisted of enslaved Africans. From 1500, they began transporting African slaves to Brazil, which would become the largest slave colony in world history. Between 1441 and 1600, the Portuguese transported between 130,000 and 160,000 African slaves. In 1600, Portugal landed 3/4 of all enslaved Africans in the Americas. The Portuguese began to lose their dominance over the transatlantic slave trade in the mid-17th century, as the Dutch, English, and French established their own slaving ports and colonial plantations. Although Portugal continued importing slaves into Brazil until the 1850s, the Atlantic slave trade was increasingly controlled by other European powers from the 1660s onward, especially the British by the 18th century. Regardless, the Portuguese imported approximately 4.9 to 5.5 million enslaved Africans to Brazil between the early 1500s and the 1850s, by far the largest share of any single country in the transatlantic slave trade. These slaves were primarily used on sugar plantations along Brazil's Atlantic coast, in regions like Bahia, Pernambuco, and later in coffee plantations in the southeast. Despite this massive slave-based system, Portugal's colonial power was eventually surpassed by Spain, which controlled a much larger empire in terms of territory, silver wealth, especially from Potosi and Mexico, and population. Unlike Spain, Portugal lacked the manpower, bureaucracy, and military reach to conquer vast inland empires. Its empire, like the Italian city-states before it in the Mediterranean, remained coastal and trade-oriented, relying on fortified ports rather than deep territorial control. While Portuguese Brazil was economically important, especially for sugar and later gold, Portugal's limited population, dependence on foreign capital, and frequent foreign occupation, such as during the Iberian Union, 1580 to 1640, meant it could never match the global reach and administrative depth of the Spanish Empire. 8. Rise and fall of the Spanish colonial system. With the unification of Castile and Aragon and the final conquest of Granada in 1492, the Spanish monarchy immediately turned from the Reconquista to colonial expansion. The Spanish state, now rich in land and with a powerful nobility trained to exploit and repress, sought to deploy its military and Catholic ideological apparatus overseas. Thus, after the Reconquista, recognizing the importance of developing a naval power, the Spanish soon mimicked the Portuguese model and embarked on a centralized state-sponsored program to develop its maritime capacities. As such, it also increasingly linked itself to Italian city-states, who offered financing, sold technical, scientific, geographical, and commercial resources for its colonial ambitions, and to support its continual wars in Europe. Alongside the Italian bankers, the Catholic Church would sanctify the conquest of the Americas, just as it had done during the wars against Islam in the Iberian Peninsula and had previously done during the Crusades in the Levant, as a religious war, which in reality had crude economic motivations. The conquistadors were often former knights of the Reconquista or their descendants, and the social relations they imposed in the colonies mirrored those they had imposed at home. The Spanish conquest of the Americas was made possible by a combination of military superiority, a surplus population from post-Reconquista Iberia, and the state's ability to mobilize and project force across the Atlantic. Unlike the Portuguese, who focused on coastal trading ports and maritime routes, the Spanish used their disciplined infantry, gunpowder weapons, and cavalry, honed in centuries of warfare against Muslim states, to launch inland expeditions and occupy vast territories. The recently unified Spanish crown had a surplus of soldiers, settlers, and adventurers, many of them unemployed veterans, ready to claim land and labor in the New World. This allowed Spain to militarily defeat and dismantle powerful empires like the Aztecs, 1519, and Incas, 1533, seizing their capitals and ruling through a combination of force, alliances with native rivals, and colonial bureaucracy. Following this rapid conquest, Spain exported its Latifundia model of land ownership to the Americas, adapting it into the hacienda system. Like the large Iberian estates, haciendas were expansive rural properties granted by the crown to conquistadors, settlers, and religious orders. These estates focused on extensive agricultural producing staples like wheat, maize, livestock, and wine for local and regional consumption. Haciendas relied on coerced labor, including indigenous workers under the encomienda, repartimiento, and later debt peonage systems. The hacienda were primarily organized around domestic consumption, not export-driven like the later plantations were. The plantations followed in the tradition of the haciendas and the latifundia, in that they were organized around large tracts of land granted to elites after conquest by the Spanish crown. The Spanish plantations and mines demanded more intensive and brutal forms of labor. In the Caribbean, coastal Central America, and parts of South America, the Spanish established sugar plantations initially worked by enslaved indigenous peoples. However, high mortality rates, demographic collapse, and later legal reforms, like the new laws of 1542, limited the availability of native labor. As a result, the Spanish increasingly turned to the African slave trade, especially in plantation zones and urban centers. In mining regions such as Potosi, Bolivia, and Zacatecas, Mexico, the labor-intensive extraction of silver relied on a mix of forced indigenous labor, the mita system, and African slaves, particularly where native populations were depleted. From 1501, Spain imported African slaves to the Caribbean to provide labor for sugar plantations. Between 1501 and 1600, approximately 100,000 Africans were imported to Spanish colonies, mainly via Portuguese and Genoese ships. By the mid-1800s, the Spanish had imported between 1.5 to 2 million slaves from Africa for its colonies primarily in the Caribbean. The shift to African slavery in certain regions marked a transformation of Spain's colonial economy from one based on conquest and tribute organized around haciendas for domestic consumption, to one increasingly tied to global capitalism and the Atlantic slave trade. While haciendas maintained a semi-feudal, land-based economy, plantations and mines became linked to international markets, producing sugar, silver, and other commodities in high demand. Thus, the inheritance of the Latifundia-style exploitation of land and labor was transferred almost entirely to the New World, where it was first applied to the indigenous populations, and then, increasingly, to African slaves on plantations. From within Spanish mines, about 16,000 to 18,000 tons of silver and 185 tons of gold was brought to Spain, the equivalent of about $200 to $400 billion today. From 1540 onwards, huge quantities of silver were extracted from the mines through the forced labor of indigenous peoples and Africans and shipped to Europe. By the end of the 16th century, 60 to 80% of the world's silver production passed through Spain. While Spain enslaved indigenous peoples and Africans to work on sugar plantations and in silver mines in the Americas, the monarchy accumulated unprecedented wealth that would change the world economy forever. In fact, despite the enormous accumulation of wealth, the backward feudal order in Spain was highly inefficient and ultimately depended on foreign financial capital and artisanal production for its survival. It is estimated that between 30 and 50% of the silver and gold extracted by the Spanish ended up in the hands of Genoese and Italian bankers to pay the debts of imperialist wars and colonial adventures. Similarly, it is estimated that during this period, 10 to 15% of its gold and silver ended up in the hands of Dutch and English privateers. Spain, with its colonial wealth, did not develop its productive forces. The monarchy used silver to finance wars against the Netherlands, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Silver quickly passed from Spain into the hands of Italian, Dutch, and French merchants and financiers. Spain declared bankruptcy several times, in 1557, 1575, 1596, and 1607. It remained an agricultural country, ruled by a landowning aristocracy hostile to bourgeois production. Industry stagnated, mainly because the aristocratic order, threatened by the rising bourgeoisie, conducted repressive campaigns that led to the expulsion of artisans. The influx of gold bullion increased the global money supply, causing inflation throughout Europe, a phenomenon known as the price revolution. Prices rose, particularly for grain and manufactured goods. The bourgeoisie, especially in non-Spanish regions, took advantage of the sale of its goods in a monetized and inflated market.